There is a huge disconnect between what's going on with the politics and then the science and what actually is required. And I must admit, I find it quite extraordinary when you hear policymakers saying, well, we can't stay below two degrees. If we try and do that, it's going to stop our economies growing or whatever. There are some scientific realities here. We have a planet of finite resources. We have an atmosphere that can only absorb a certain amount of greenhouse gases without triggering climate catastrophe. So it seems to me that we need to get our realities realigned, and the reality we need to be looking at is the scientific reality, and then we work out how we share out in an equitable way the emissions that allows us, really keeping in mind as well that obviously the poorest countries need to be the most emissions room. I think it's a great shame that we don't have a stronger indication yet that this will be a binding protocol. That's obviously what we need. I guess we can take some comfort perhaps from something that Obama said in recent days, that maybe certain aspects of the agreement could be binding. So, for example, he was talking about the so-called ratchet mechanism, the thing that will allow us to review progress every 5 years. That process of review could be binding. That's something, but obviously the whole process would be so much stronger if it was binding, if it was mandatory. I think what we're witnessing right now is kind of like the last death throes, I hope, of a fossil fuel industry that is lobbying governments like mad because they can see the writing on the wall. I do believe it's possible to get away from fossil fuels. We didn't end the Stone Age because we ran out of stones. We worked out better ways of doing things, and I'm fairly confident that if the political will is there, and if that means that if there's enough public pressure on politicians as well, of course we could get to 100% renewables by 2050. But we need the political will, and that's what this process is all about. As a British politician, to be honest, my biggest focus is on trying to make sure that the British government is leading the way by its actions, not just by its words. And I must admit, quite disappointed that at the same time that David Cameron is using warm words in Paris, back at home, he's taking a wrecking ball to green policy. He is slashing support for renewables. He is building in a legal obligation to maximise the economic recovery of fossil fuels. What could be more perverse than that? So I recognise that we've got a job of work really domestically to make sure our leaders are actually delivering on the ground what they might be pledging here in Paris. But where I take some comfort is that I think actually in many senses quite a lot of business is now ahead of where the politicians are. I think, as I say, there's this still battle going on as people try to get used to the new reality, and of course there'll be some fossil fuel companies with big vested interests who are going to be lobbying till their very last gasp. But I do sense that we are on the cusp of a different kind of future, a different kind of energy future, and I hope that Paris will play its part in that.
Politics can really incentivise business by legislating in the right way and this kind of thing. Do you think that's starting to happen now on an international sort of level?
I think increasingly businesses are lobbying on an international level. They're coming together and just really pleading with the politicians, saying, we just want a level playing field. We want certainty. We want to know what the green policies are going to be so that we can adapt. And I think what's been so frustrating, going back to the situation in the UK, is that climate policy and environmental policy seems to change almost on a weekly basis. And so it's incredibly difficult to make investment decisions for companies. So I think, as I say, that if the political will were there just to set the direction of travel and to stop giving mixed messages, like suddenly deciding to lock in 35 years worth of nuclear power at the same time as we're supposed to be moving to a decentralized grid, a flexible grid and so forth, if we could have some consistent messaging from governments, I think businesses would be perfectly happy to come along. I think there really is a moral dimension to the climate debate, and it just strikes me, particularly in the aftermath. We've just been having big debates in Britain and I'm sure elsewhere about what to do after the Paris terrorist attacks, those terrible attacks. David Cameron back home in the UK has strongly been saying that we have a moral responsibility to stand by France and to, in his view, take steps to bring airstrikes over Syria. Now, it just interests me that he can see the moral imperative there. I might disagree with him about the action that he takes, but I agree there's a moral imperative to do something about the Syria crisis. But why isn't that same moral imperative there when we're talking about people dying not through terrorism, but through climate-related disasters that we are implicated in? We are complicit in that if we do not change the way we produce and consume. So it seems to me that there is a strong moral argument here, and there's also a moral inconsistency between the kinds of arguments political leaders are bringing to bear when it comes to making the argument for airstrikes over Syria, let's say, and yet that same moral argument isn't there when it comes to reducing our climate emissions.